At the beginning of the film, we see a woman named Julia on a journey in a taxi with her husband Francis, heading to an apartment in Bucharest, Romania. Julia follows her husband moving from America to Romania because he took a marketing job there. During the trip, Francis speaks Romanian with the taxi driver. Francis is fluent in Romanian since he has heritage from the country passed down from his mother. Meanwhile, Julia, who doesn't understand Romanian, can only listen to the conversation without comprehending it. Soon after, they arrive at the apartment they rented. They are greeted by the apartment owner and immediately taken to their room. Upon entering the room, they start being affectionate. After midnight, heavy rain falls, making Julia unable to sleep. Julia then gets up from bed and gazes at the streets and buildings around her residence through a large glass window. There, Julia sees someone staring at her from a building across the street. Initially, she doesn't suspect anything and returns to bed to cuddle with her husband. In short, Francis then takes Julia out of the apartment for a walk. Suddenly, at the end of the street, they see people and several police officers gathered near an ambulance. They approach and ask what is happening. Not getting a clear answer, they decide to leave the place immediately. The next day, while Julia is watching television, she accidentally sees a news broadcast about the incident on the street they passed last night. Since the announcer is speaking Romanian, Julia asks Francis, who translates that there was a murder last night with a female victim. Hearing this from her husband, Julia tells him about a mysterious man who stares at her every night from the building across the street with a very strange gaze. However, Francis doesn't take Julia's words seriously and says it might just be a coincidence. That night, they receive a visit from Francis's old friend named Simeon and his wife. In short, after hearing the confession from the woman in the video, Julia becomes more frightened. When she walks alone, she starts to feel that someone is following her. Julia then tries to avoid and enter a cinema, but upon arrival, she sees the cinema is empty with only a few people inside. Moments later, Julia feels that the mysterious man has entered the cinema and is sitting behind her. Slightly panicked, Julia quickly leaves the cinema and enters a supermarket, thinking it is safer because there are many people there. While inside the supermarket, Julia, who wanted to shop, was shocked to see the man she thought had been following her standing behind her. Panicked, Julia ran out using the back door of the supermarket and rushed back to her apartment. That night, after Francis came home, Julia recounted all the strange events she experienced that day, where a mysterious man kept following her, starting from the cinema and then inside the supermarket. Shortly after, they heard a loud knock on the door. Filled with fear, Julia mustered the courage to approach the door. When she opened it, she found that it was an old woman, their neighbor, looking for her missing cat. Since the old woman spoke Romanian, Julia could only stand silent, as she didn't understand what the woman was saying. At the same time, Irina arrived and told Julia that the woman was looking for her missing cat, named Elfish. After the old woman returned to her room, Irina invited Julia into her room for a drink. Feeling lonely, Julia accepted Irina's invitation, and they started talking, sharing their lives with each other. Shortly after, while they were engrossed in conversation, a knock was heard on Irina's door. Irina remained silent and said that it was her ex-boyfriend, Christian, but she didn't want to see him. In short, Francis then moved to the window and raised his middle finger towards the man in the building across the street. However, by then, the room was already dark. Julia decided to call the police and started explaining her discomfort while staying in the apartment. Accompanied by Francis, the police went to the room of the person who had been watching Julia. However, when Francis returned, he said there was no one there, and he assumed Julia was just hallucinating. Hearing Francis's words made Julia angry and upset with her husband. The next morning, while Julia was buying cigarettes, she accidentally saw the man who had been stalking her walking by. Julia followed him until he entered an alley leading to a large building. After following him, she found that he had entered a strip club filled with many lecherous men. Inside, Julia saw the man she'd been following working there as a cleaner. A few moments later, Irina, who also worked there, saw Julia and took her aside to talk about why Julia was there. The next day, after Francis left, Julia was seen calling someone at Irina's workplace to ask about Irina's whereabouts, since she had not returned to her apartment the previous night. A few moments later, Julia saw Christian coming to look for Irina and approached him. saying that Irina did not come home last night. Julia tried calling Irina, but there was no answer, and it turned out Irina's phone was inside the apartment. After that, Julia asked Christian to accompany her to meet the stranger who she thought had been watching her. When they arrived, Julia pointed out the man's room, and Christian started knocking on the door. After knocking several times, Christian came back to Julia and said that the room was empty. Not satisfied with the first knock, Julia asked Christian to knock again, and Christian then did it a bit harder. But still, there was no sign of anyone in the room. Due to an urgent matter, Christian then left Julia alone in the building. A bit scared, Julia walked up to the door and started knocking again. This time the door opened and an old man appeared, asking what Julia wanted. Terrified, Julia left the old man and walked away. In short, Julia and Francis then went to a party organized by Francis's company. Upon arrival, Francis and his friends were chatting in Romanian, which made Julia a bit curious. After getting closer, Julia understood a bit of what her husband was saying, and it turned out he had made jokes about her ongoing anxieties. Realizing this, Julia got angry and left the party. With a broken heart, Francis tried to catch up with Julia, but she still wanted to leave. They argued, and Francis said he was tired of all his wife's imaginations, and he left Julia there alone. Unable to get a taxi, Julia took the subway. Coincidentally or not, Weber was also in the same subway. Due to some issues, the train suddenly stopped for a while. Weber then approached Julia and sat in front of her. He said that he lived in the building across from Julia's apartment with his sick father, and sometimes looked out the window just to see people. Then Julia noticed the plastic bag Weber was carrying seemed to contain a human head. After a long conversation about her discomfort, Julia apologized for her concerns. Shortly after, someone covered Julia's head from behind with a plastic bag, causing her to pass out. The stranger was Weber, and while holding a knife to Julia's neck, Weber recounted how he had brutally murdered Irina. Weber also said that the other day when Julia and the apartment owner entered Irina's room, he was hiding in a closet with Irina's corpse. Soon after, Francis was heard calling Julia from their room. At that moment, Weber slit Julia's throat to prevent her from answering her husband's call. With all her strength, Julia crawled to retrieve the gun Irina had hidden. However, she stopped as she lost a lot of blood, causing her to lose strength and consciousness. In short, after killing Irina and Julia, Weber hurriedly left the room. Hearing his wife's phone ringing in Irina's room, Francis went out to check. At the same time, Weber exited the room. When Francis tried to ask him something, a bullet suddenly pierced Weber's body from behind. It turned out to be Julia, who had managed to get up and grab Irina's gun from the drawer. Julia then blindly shot Weber, finally killing him gruesomely. After that, Julia came out of the room and stared at Francis strangely, and the film ended. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, because by subscribing you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.